interesting. So I until this year, I put down the teaching because I want to focus on things here. But I have continued to teach at a seminary, and one course that I taught was 6 hours postgraduate. The reason it was postgraduate, we got a lot of folks who would come into Anglicanism, and then they were ministers in other traditions. So they have a divinity degree, they have the 3-year seminary degree. However, they don't have the specifics that we have. And I would get Baptists, Methodists, Lutherans. I even had the Lutheran bishop from Latvia take the course, which is kind of funny. Non-denominational folks, Pentecostals, Presbyterians, Roman Catholics even, who have come over into the Anglican communion. And I never told them at the very end of the course their final essay question. I would never tell them in advance because I didn't want them to prepare for that. But their final essay question was, what is an Anglican? Which a lot of times they would just sweat about, like, it's such an easy question, but I think that they were wondering what I wanted to hear. So, what is an Anglican? Well, take that in. Henry VIII, whose wife, Catherine of Aragon, was the cousin of the Holy Roman Emperor. And some of this I've talked about before in a different way, so you might pick up little bits and pieces you've heard from me before, and if you remember it, that's good. That means it's working. Okay. For this reason, though, with Henry, and this is the only reason he was not given a divorce, was because of that relationship. Pope Clement VII refused to issue an annulment to their marriage. And for those of you who don't know, an annulment pronunciation by the Roman Catholic Church means that a marriage was not valid in the first place. It means that they weren't actually really truly married in the first place. And that was commonplace for the Pope to do that, especially for those in high places. So this would have been a non-issue. The problem for Henry was that his wife, again, is the cousin, I'm not recording, to the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. And ever notice how Anglicans know? Has anybody ever called an Anglican a Henryist? Yeah. But we call those who follow Luther Lutherans. Let that sink in too.
Hit the red.
Yeah, here. Thank you. So nobody accuses the German reformer Martin Luther of, thank you, starting this Reformation over a divorce. But divorce is salacious, so we like to talk about it. As we heard earlier today, it's something that people bring up and they get their oohs and their ahs. But both the Anglican and Lutheran Reformations were both incredibly political. That might rub you wrong, but hold that thought. The Protestant Reformation in many ways was very political. That will be very important later. But put simply, the Lutheran Reformation was as much a political revolt as it ever was a theological one. Political expediency among many of the princes in the Holy Roman Empire made the embrace of a revolt by reformers against the prevailing social order politically and economically advantageous. So here's what I mean by later. Some people get shocked and say, and it's particularly our Roman Catholic friends, well, you guys all broke away because of a divorce and different things, and the Protestant Reformation is a political thing. And I would argue that the church has always been political. And I'm going to read this at length, so hang on. This is from 1 Samuel, the 8th chapter, beginning with the 10th verse. And to set it up, Israel has just had the ebb and flow of judges. They do well, they do bad. God sends a judge, they do well, they do bad. And then finally Israel goes to God through the prophet Samuel and says, we want a king like everybody else. And so this is how this story goes. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. He said, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. So God is telling us, once we want kings, this is what it's going to be like moving forward. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest and to make his implements of war the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. This is the stuff that the king will do, which is to say, this is the stuff that an established government will do. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his servants. He will take your male servants and your female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. Here's the thing, God is involved in politics. We asked for politics, even though God gave us himself early on through his prophets and his word. And this continues into the New Testament. These pictures are from the Dore Bible. I've described that before. A very, very famous Bible that was illustrated, and the carvings in it are fantastic. God being involved in politics is not an Old Testament thing. Who is that and what's going on there? Anybody want to guess? Jesus. Who's he standing before there? Pilate. He is very involved with politics. This carries over into the New Testament. In the person of Jesus Christ, he was actively engaging and working with through political structures and politicians. So anyone who wants to say, what is an Anglican, you can't answer it, well, it's somebody whose church was started because somebody wanted a divorce for political reasons. God is always involved in world affairs. Some people will say Elizabeth created Anglicanism. Yes, it is the Elizabethan settlement, but we're not called Elizabethans. Another false argument against Anglicanism is that a queen, a political entity, created Anglicanism. So to be an Anglican means to follow Elizabeth, who is not a clergy person. The Elizabethan settlement was a series of laws and political arrangements that sought to ease religious tension during her reign. And there are four of them. I'll run these by you. The Act of Supremacy, that means that in the Church of England, the head of the church is the ruler. By the way, that goes back to Henry VIII. That was part of his declaration against the Pope, was he is the supreme head of the Church of England. The Act of Uniformity, it made Protestantism the official religion of England and set out rules for religious practice and worship. The Book of Common Prayer provided prayers in English for people. When it says common prayer, it doesn't mean it's average. It's the book of very average prayers. What it means, it's for everybody. It means it's for all people. And lastly, the 39 articles, which are part of the Elizabethan settlement. So in our catechism, we still have the 39 articles as well as in the back of the prayer book. So God has used these four arrangements, and I would argue especially the Book of Common Prayer, to evangelize the world. To give you perspective, there are 85 million Anglican Christians in the world who use, in some consistent form, the Book of Common Prayer. So what about Elizabeth? And I think this is very sweet, actually. For those of you who are raising kids and they ask what's going on during communion, have them learn that little jingle. Elizabeth didn't start the Anglican communion, but by her simple and devout faith, she required the subjects, all of whom were Christian at this time in England, to get along. She is basically a matriarch telling her children, behave. Elizabeth did not start the Anglican communion. We're not called Elizabethus because there was a church in England before there was a church of England. So let me show you what I mean by that. I'll take you back a little bit. This is a fresco dating back to 1247 in a Benedictine monastery in Italy, and it depicts that right there in the middle is Constantine, and that's Pope Sylvester, and he's riding and he's handing off his horse, and take a guess what Constantine is offering to the Pope. His crown. The emperor, abjectly grateful, not only confirmed the Bishop of Rome as the head above all other bishops. So this is the moment in history where the Bishop of Rome, who is a bishop equal with all bishops, provincial bishops, this is a moment where he says, I am bishop of all bishops. The emperor resigned his imperial insignia and walked before Sylvester's horse holding the Pope's bridle as the papal groom. The Pope in return offered the crown of his own goodwill to Constantine. So he gives Constantine the crown. Constantine gives the Pope the crown. The Pope blesses it and hands it back to Constantine. And at that point, the emperor abandoned Rome and took residence in Constantinople, not because he rejected him, but because the Bishop of Rome should be the only leader in that part, even though it's the Holy Roman Empire. The doctrine behind this charming story is a radical one. The Pope is supreme over all rulers, even the Roman Emperor, who owes his crown to the Pope and may therefore be deposed by papal decree. At this point, if the Pope didn't like the Emperor, he could throw him out. So now the Pope is head bishop over Christendom. Before this, all bishops were equal. You just had your area and you got together and you worked through things. And to give you an idea, this prior to this happening in the 4th century, the Council of Arles in 314. There is no Pope, there are only bishops. And this is the first representative meeting of Christian bishops in the Western Roman Empire. There they had some English bishops sitting there who was equal, even though the Bishop of Rome's there, he's not the Pope yet, but that Bishop of England was just as equal at that meeting as the Bishop of Rome. Oh, how things have changed. So Roman Britain, we're talking in the 4th century, there are Christians in Rome. Well, how in the world did Christianity get to England? It's a whole island away. It was introduced in the 3rd century by immigrants, legionnaires, and tradesmen, mostly legionnaires. They were soldiers. The legions were made up mostly of Punic, that means they were from Carthage and Tunisia, and Libyan soldiers. As Italy and Gaul struggled to have enough soldiers, they would conquer an area and make them go to work as soldiers. It is not unusual in history for Christianity to be spread through military campaigns. The British Church, keep this in mind, was organized regionally by the early 4th century. There is no Church of England yet. There is no Bishop of Rome, but there is a church in England that is autonomous and running itself. By the 200s, Christianity is clearly in England. By 300s, it's firmly established. So, to my point, before Roman Catholicism was established, before the Anglican Church was established as the Church of England, there was a church in England before there was a Church of England. So in the 5th century, anybody want to guess who this guy is? Oh, before you say, by the way, those are actual reconstructed to what a legionnaire would have looked like, and many of them were on horses, and that's what he would have looked like. You can see he looks a bit like Frodo in Lord of the Rings, but a whole lot lighter weight, assuming a lot more risk up on the horse. So they're, quite the fighting force. Anybody want to guess? Look at the color of on top of his head. That might help. St. Patrick. It's St. Patrick. In the 5th century, he's doing missionary work in Wales and Ireland. That is actually from 1603, and there was this idea, there was a campaign in Ireland back then in the early 17th century. We need to make Ireland more Roman Catholic. The Latin inscription above it translates as, the Pope greatly wishes an increase of Catholic faith and spiritual grace to the Senate and people of the fair city in Dublin, Ireland. It indicates that, like I said, it was to encourage people in their faith. The irony is here that during Patrick's life, the Pope never exercised any authority over all England. So that's or Wales or Ireland. So it's kind of funny that they're trying to insert this idea that Ireland is a strong Roman Catholic bastion when during Patrick's time, he was just a missionary there working with local folks. In fact, as we think about this, the idea of the Bishop of Rome being the Pope, the supreme bishop above all others, one of the greatest popes, probably the greatest pope of all time, was Gregory the Great, 6th century pope. In fact, his book, Pastoral Ministry, is one that I would use in the pastoral ministry course because it has endured for 1,500 years. It's wonderful. But Gregory the Great, probably the greatest pope of all, said this: "Whoever calls himself or desires to be called universal priest," that would be pope, "in his elation is the precursor of the Antichrist." So when people say things about, oh, the Pope's the Antichrist, it actually goes back to Gregory the Great. That's not a new thing. That's not how Lindsay and everyone else on TBN. And why? So when in England, where we have these autonomous English Christians who are doing their own thing, being faithful, when does Rome really get involved? And the irony of all this, the reason, one of the two main reasons that Rome got involved had to do with a haircut. And I'm not kidding. The reason was the monks in England cut their hair one way, and the monks in Rome cut their hair another way. Yeah, and the other reason was the date of Easter. So the Pope at the time found this out and was very upset about their haircuts. And so they got involved, and it's really kind of funny because that's the one they went with. We actually don't have very many pictures of the English haircut. We think it was kind of a triangle, which is kind of funny. I dare you to cut your hair like that. Anyway, this is what they went with, and they were actually having an argument about it. And as legend has it, this is what the soldiers did to St. Peter before they crucified him to make fun of him. They just shaved the top of his head to make a crown out of his hair, to be like Jesus. Well, the Roman Catholic argument was that haircut you guys have in England is from Simon Magus, who was, as you know in the New Testament, was a sorcerer, like a demonic sorcerer. And so their argument was like, which side do you want to be on, Simon Magus or St. Peter? Well, at that point in time, that won, and now the Church of England, over a haircut, is under the Church of Rome. Yeah. These things don't happen overnight. Okay. But there is still within English-speaking Christians who are Anglicans. They are geographic Anglicans. They're not an Anglican church, but they're called Anglicans because that area of the world, they were called Angles. Why did it take so long for Rome to put their hands on England and the rest of what we would call today the United Kingdom? Here is why. If you are in Rome, which is very refined, those of you who've been to Rome, much of what you see goes back to the time I'm describing right now. It's very refined, very well educated. England and the United Kingdom were largely agrarian folks and farmers. They thought all those people on the islands were a bunch of poor country bumpkins, and they really didn't want to bother themselves with them. So that's why for centuries, Rome just kind of let the English-speaking folks do their own thing over there, which is funny when we think today about England being so refined and having a stiff upper lip and all that. Rome thought that they were rednecks for their time. So it's very, very interesting. So England is always, since they are the last, the United Kingdom, the last group of folks in the Western world to come under the Bishop of Rome, the last group of churches, means that they've had an independent spirit coming up to this point. And it doesn't go away. There is a picture of the Magna Carta. It was issued in June of 1215. And one thing that's very important in there is this statement. This is what gives us freedom of religion in the United States. It appeals directly back to this. In fact, we have Supreme Court cases as recently as 2012 that cite this. And this is in the Magna Carta. In the first place, we have granted to God, and by this our present charter confirmed for us and our heirs forever, that the English Church, now they don't call it the Anglican Church, they don't call it the Church of England, they call it the English Church. It is basically an autonomous group of people on an island worshiping Jesus. The English Church shall be free and shall have her rights entire and her liberties inviolate. Submitting to the Bishop of Rome based on this is not required. The irony here is Roman Catholics who are in England would use the Magna Carta against Henry VIII. If you're an Englishman and you don't want to be under the Bishop of Rome, you appeal to this. If you're a Roman Catholic and Henry says that he's the head of the church, then you appeal to this too. And so it ended up working both ways against both Roman Catholics and Protestants. So to answer what is an Anglican at this point is very, very difficult on the island of England. You might answer one way if you don't want to be under England's rule. You might answer another way, you definitely would, if you were under Roman Catholic rule. If you get it if you know history, okay? The Church of England remains under the Church of Rome until the 16th century. So that's about 400 years. Think about this. In the history of the Church of England, it was only solidly under Rome for about 400 years. And even then, it was like long-distance dating. Okay. It's at this point that Henry VIII stakes a claim to a religiously free and self-determined church in England and is designated as the Church of England finally. So if you were to ask an early Anglican, what is an Anglican? They actually had something that they wanted you to know. And it's attributed to Lancelot Andrewes. What is an Anglican? One canon, that means the Bible, reduced to writing by God himself. 2 testaments, that means it's the Old and the New Testament. 3 creeds, the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, and the Athanasian Creed. 4 general councils, and they'll pick up on the back end because it's not just 4 councils. 4 general councils. Councils are when the church meets as a whole. For the first 1,000 years of Christianity, if you were going to change a doctrine, everyone had to get together and agree. If they didn't, it was tabled till the next time. That is why, when within the Episcopal Church, a small section said, we are going to have gay marriage, they didn't do it as a council. They didn't talk to the wider Anglican communion. They just declared it. That's why we fragmented. This continues. This 5 centuries and the series of fathers in that period. That's why when we look at a text, particularly a difficult text, we look, where is the consensus of the early church? They are closest to the early message of Jesus Christ. We want to try and keep in step with them. The centuries, that is, before Constantine and 2 after, he's talking about councils. So the first 7 centuries of councils determine the boundary of our faith. Now, I'm not going to go over this, but these are the first 7 councils. These are the ones, and these are in our 39 Article of Religion. These are the councils that we say that we set the church to follow, because the reason is these are the councils of the undivided church. This is when we all met as a whole, and even though we had our differences, because the doctrinal against the heresy of something, we're having a family fight, and we're going to come to an agreement, and everyone has to walk out on one sheet of music. And if you want these slides or that just to look at, it's actually very interesting. I can send it to you. So that gets us up to the 17th century now. The Puritan movement now has led to the English Civil War. Now, the Puritan movements were largely evangelicals who didn't want any rule over them. They were very much Congregationalists. They wanted the local congregation to be left alone and do their own thing. Then you have the English Civil Wars and the Commonwealth, but the Church of England and the monarchy was reestablished in 1660. The reason why, after the English Civil Wars, people were so tired of the fighting, they were so tired of everything, they weren't getting along. They said, would you just please give us a king back? Would you please? We'll take a king. It's kind of like Israel early on. And so the Puritans themselves weren't just at war with Anglicans, they were also at war with Roman Catholics. So now, our old enemy, it's like Sun Tzu says, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So now, Anglicans and Roman Catholics decide to get along against the Puritans. At the final defeat of the Royalists in the English Civil War against Oliver Cromwell's New Model Army at the Battle of Worcester in 1651, the future Charles II, that's him right there, King of England, his father had been beheaded. At first, this is him running away to get away, because you know who's next is the king's son. Now, history writes about this as being very elaborate, but she is riding side saddle, and they're very well dressed. So the getaway, at least they went out in style. This painting is in the National Portrait Gallery in London. And at this time in history, it becomes very, very difficult to explain what an Anglican is, because you have those who were Church of England who are now working with their old enemies, the Roman Catholics, and you have the Puritans. And all three of them are under the rubric of Anglican, meaning they're from England. And so it becomes very difficult. Well, time goes on to the 18th century, and the Church of England is recast in its original Anglican mold. And so we're getting back to the basics, which is always a good thing. But there's actually, and I would argue, a good new evangelical zeal within it that it didn't have before. The evangelical movement promoted Protestant customs, while the Church of England spread to other parts in the world through missionaries. So during colonialism, you have the missionary movement. Our friends in Africa, our great bishops in Africa, they often tell us that you sent the missionaries here, we're coming back to evangelize you because you no longer believe the faith that you brought to us. And even though we have the 39 Articles of Religion that have defined Anglicans since 1571, some evangelicals are pushing back. So some who are evangelical within Anglicanism don't like it. So what is an Anglican becomes difficult to answer, as it resembles evangelical influence more than the small o Orthodox history and practice. During this time, the liturgy of the church is largely lost. So as you know, with any movement in history, anytime the pendulum swings one way, get ready, here it comes. Because I'll give you a great example. 80s and 90s in the United States, Ralph Reed and the moral majority, things swung hard to the right. And for conservatives, we thought, well, the pendulum will just stay there. No, it hasn't. It swung harder the other way. So that's what happened in England. So in the 19th century, the Oxford movement highlighted the historic heritage of the church, going back to the practices and customs of early Christianity. It's an interesting mix now of evangelization of the poor with high churchmanship. So these folks who became high churchmen, they weren't just wearing pretty things like we like to wear, but they were going down to the docks in London and evangelizing people. One example is the Society of the Holy Cross. These early priests of that society ministered in some of the poorest slum areas of London and other cities. These included the parishes of London's docks. Many of these areas were so dangerous that the bishops refused to visit them, although their refusal was also motivated by a distaste for the ritualism of the Anglo-Catholic clergy. So you have these guys end up going high church, they're reaching out to the poor, and the bishops are like, well, I don't like you guys, you're high church, and you're around some really scary people. So they don't go down and see what they're up to. For those of you who've seen On the Waterfront, whenever I think about this, it reminds me of Carl Malden's character, Father Pete. I don't know if those of you have seen it, he's down in the hull of the ship and they drop the cargo and kill him. But he's down there in the worst part of the city ministering to the poor. So if you were asked at this time in history, what is an Anglican? It was likely a high church Englishman who takes the Great Commission seriously. That brings us to the 20th century. The Church of England became active in the ecumenical movement, which promotes worldwide Christian unity. So in the ecumenical movement, we thought maybe, just maybe, that we could get everybody together as one church, as I mentioned, like when we used to have councils and all agree on things. Some understanding was gained through this movement, but inevitably, when you try to boil down, and think about this, when you try to distill a group of ultimate beliefs, when I say ultimate beliefs, are things that are non-negotiable. When you try to distill that to the fewest common denominators, the things that the non-negotiables we all share, it's starting to get really small, and then we say, we're just going to talk about these things. You end up with a watered-down belief system. The result of the World Council of Churches, that's what that is right there, that's their meeting, of which Anglicans were the primary force, because we were one of the biggest ones behind this as Anglicans, was a very, very watered-down small faith. A better understanding would be, if we wanted to do this right, would be, what are the details of the small o, not Eastern Orthodox or Russian Orthodox, but what do Orthodox small o Christians all agree with? Then we can live in that space, but instead we went far lower. And it hurt the church. The watering down made it a whole lot easier now to tell the world what is an Anglican. So the result of the very small faith makes that very easy. At this time, the question in the United States would be, what is an Episcopalian? And it's easy because the faith had become so watered down that there wasn't really much to say. In fact, this might sound odd, but prior to the 1960s, this is from Time magazine, the Episcopal Church was described as the Republican Party at prayer. I know. Now we get to the 21st century. The Church of England allowed priests to bless same-sex relationships, which led to Orthodox Anglicans to reestablish the historic faith. In fact, up there on your right is Bishop Gene Robinson, to his husband, who he would later divorce. This is also, by the way, after Robinson divorced his wife and left his children. This led to faithful Anglicans to aggregate, to get together and reconstitute themselves in groups such as GAFCON and the Global South. J.D. mentioned GAFCON today in his sermon. Our province, the Anglican Church in North America, is part of this. Now it's become much easier to define the question, what is an Anglican? One of the things we go by is now we have all signed for Orthodox, Jesus-loving, Bible-believing, Great Commission-focused Anglicans. We have signed on to the Jerusalem Declaration. Now, the Jerusalem Declaration has 14 points that are much larger than these, and in my fallibility, I've tried to reduce them down, because I think it's important to just quickly look at these, because these are things that affect our Anglican identity. Justification by grace, Scripture from a historic and consensual reading. Remember what I said about where do the church fathers agree? We believe in where there's consensus in church history. We need to follow that interpretation of Scripture. That is the only true understanding of God and salvation. The historic creeds and councils, our 3 creeds, as I already mentioned, our first 7 councils of the church. The 39 articles of religion. The lordship of Jesus Christ without exception. The Book of Common Prayer. But the Book of Common Prayer even says within the prayer book, you have local use, which means we will have the same basic prayer and outline of the service. If you go to Africa, it's going to look different. If you go to Minnesota, it's going to look different, okay? But we all have the same Book of Common Prayer and the same essentials within it. The threefold ministry of bishops, priests, and deacons. Historically contingent understanding of human anthropology and sexuality. We believe what Christians always believe until 2 sneezes ago about what a man is and what a woman is. The importance of the Great Commission, we're not just inward focused. Stewardship of creation. Ecumenical relations with other Orthodox Christians. This goes back to what I said about the World Council of Churches. We'll meet and we'll have dialogue with other Christians, but you have to hold foundational Christian beliefs. And we gooped that up earlier and we paid for it. Freedom of local expression, that's what I meant by you can kind of use a prayer book in a way with a bishop's approval that works with your local congregation. Rejection of the heterodox and heretics. Rather than saying, in the past we said, well, that's not us. Now we say that's not us and that's bad, and you shouldn't do that because you're going to damage your soul. And we believe also in the second coming of Christ. Now you can go and read these online. They're unpacked with a lot more detail, but I just want to give you the bottom line. So now, with about 3 minutes left, you're in the elevator and somebody's talking to you, and you got your Bible. Let's say you're out of town, and you do like our family does. When we're out of town, we get excited to go see other churches because we just like to hear new ideas and see things. And also, as clergy, we like to go and brag about y'all. It's like, well, this is great, but here's what we're doing. You might want to think about this. And so it's a lot of fun. So you're doing the good thing. You're there, or maybe you're one of our winter birds. It's summer and you're somewhere else, and so you're in the elevator and somebody asks you, what is an Anglican? This should be your first response. What is an Anglican? An Anglican is one of 85 million Christians today who continue the faith of the undivided church, best expressed in the ancient creeds and early church councils, under the authority of the Bible as reformed and recovered in the Reformation. That is simply it. Now, if that's me in an elevator, the next question they're going to ask is, oh, so you're not Roman Catholic? To which I respond to the question, oh, you're not Roman Catholic with this. Holding fast to the worship doctrine and order of the early church as recovered and reestablished by the Reformation is what makes us small c Catholics, though we are not Roman Catholic. We are small c Catholics because, like we say in the Creed, we believe in one holy Catholic and apostolic church. It means the church throughout the world, in times past, in times future, into eternity, that we're part of that. That is what an Anglican is. And so this is the last thing I have, and we might have a minute for a question, but I think it's important to share this. This is the Church of St. Martin. It's an ancient church from the Church of England parish back in Canterbury, England. It's the oldest church building in Britain still used as a church. So they're still worshiping there. And it goes back to the early 7th century. So now for 1,500 years almost, people have been worshiping, faithful Christians in that building. It's the oldest existing parish church in the English-speaking world. In many ways, to be an Anglican is to be like that church there of St. Martin that's still at it. It's beautiful, it's tried and true, and it's built to last. What are your questions? Questions? Feel free to ask. All right, well, thank you for your attention. I appreciate it. Yeah. That's funny, Yeah. I mean, it's still here and we're still growing, which is crazy. Yeah. St. Martin's in Canterbury. Yeah, I know. Well, we were talking about going to Jerusalem, last year. I think we should go see the sites in England.
Oh,
Yeah.
Awesome.
Oh, thanks.
Gotta get those slides, man.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, thanks.
How about